All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to, if you're in Australia, Thursdays, Accessing Justice During COVID-19, a special portable webinar to find new ways to provide empathetic and safe legal services during the current crisis that we find ourselves in. So my name is Sarah Kaur, and I'm going to be facilitating the webinar today. And we'd like to begin today's meeting by acknowledging that we at Portable are living and working on the lands of the Wiradjuri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We extend these respects to the First Nations people who are joining us today. Personally, I grew up. And I will just ask everyone who isn't myself actually to please put themselves on mute. That would be excellent, thank you. And we'll try to maintain a general mute unless you're speaking policy through the webinar today. Thank you. I grew up on Ngunnawal land in Canberra and I called that home until I moved to Wiradjuri land in North Fitzroy in Melbourne, and this has become my beloved home and a place that I'm grateful to be able to return to whenever I venture out into the world, which I must admit is not very often these days. So in this webinar, I will be your host. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Portable, and we are joined today by two very special guest speakers from the justice sector, Shannon Salter, the Chair of the Civil Resolution Tribunal in Canada, and Jane Sippens, Director of Client Services in Legal Aid New South Wales in Australia. And I will also be joined by two of my colleagues at Portable, Simon Goodrich, co-founder at Portable and fellow at the Sir Zelman Cowen Centre at Victoria University, as well as Luke Thomas, who has a Juris Doctor from Melbourne Law School and is Portable's legal design specialist. This approximately, and we will use the last 10 to 15 minutes for an audience question and answer session. So as participants, our panelists, you will be able to see and access the question and answer and a chat screen through the Zoom interface. I encourage you to post any questions you have about the presentation for our panelists today in the Q&A panel, and I will be directing these questions directly to the panelists, mostly saving them till the end of our hour together. I encourage you, though, throughout the webinar to post comments in the chat window and use this as an opportunity to discuss, share ideas and comments with the community of participants online, respectfully, of course. So on screen now, you can see an agenda of the themes that we'll be covering off. And really, we've called it today to consider the social and technical changes in the operating environment of justice during COVID-19 and what opportunities there are for investing in the infrastructure and improving the user experience of courts in the legal system. So if we go to the next slide now, we really wanted to talk about this because we had a number of questions, including how do we attend court when we're all in a lockdown? How can our police and legal aid practitioners and court staff provide services safely and keep safe themselves while still maintaining access to justice for all? For a traditionally conservative sector, there is now an imperative for our justice sector to adapt and quickly. Far from a short-term disadvantage, at Portable we see an opportunity and an imperative to usher in new approaches in legal design, innovation and technology to continue delivering access to justice in a new era. If we go to the next slide, talk a little bit about Portable. So Portable is a research, design and technology company based in Melbourne, Australia. Our mission is to seek out areas of social need and policy failure to create transformational change using research, design and technology. So there's about 45 of us made up mostly of researchers, designers, developers and a data scientist. And justice has been a pillar of our work for the last 4 years. We've released a report called Design for Justice, which is available on our website, portable.com.au, which unpacks our approach towards a vision where access to justice is a reality, where government services exceed the expectations of citizens and design, technology, and innovation are used to support the justice system. On the next slide, A couple of the themes we wanted to invite our panelists and participants on the chat to consider, including usually that court experiences include it's crowded, people are waiting forever. Now I think we're going to start seeing nobody in courts. And so how are these people going to be able to access justice in the court system? A question posed by Dr. Joe McIntyre, an academic from the University of South Australia. Earlier this year, he said, look, the physical architecture of courts has been something that has evolved over thousands of years. It conveys a sense of import and place and gravity, and that's part of going to court as a physical experience. And so if we are going to transition to a remote experience or an online experience, what is the architecture of an online court? And I think that's a really interesting kind of proposal to consider. And another theme, what happens when you try to make the most of this opportunity to provide a better experience during a legal journey for someone in COVID-19, but what experiences and learnings can we have and take forward? So to tell you more about what's important to consider about the current time, here's Portable's co-founder, Simon Goodrich.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar this morning or your evening if you're based over in other parts of the world. I think we'll reflect back on March 2020 as a period where pretty much everything changed and things are changing at a pace that I think none of us have seen or expecting. Some of you may have seen this tweet going around over the last week. And look, there's a lot of truth in that, where a lot of the decisions that are being made in March, now going into April, are decisions that are happening quicker than any of us considered, and probably will have long-lasting legacies too. I think when we do reflect back and look at this period as we're coming in, I guess, into the outset of this pandemic, I just look at the amount of discussions and calls we've had with people from the legal sector, whether it be those in the police force, those within courts, those within accessing justice, and effectively we've shifted from an intention of a digital transformation, which has been there for a number of years, and looking at things such as human-centered design at the forefront of change, and now really looking for us to recognise this isn't a drill, this is happening now. And I guess one thing that we're wanting to consider for all of us in this webinar today is that the decisions that we make in March and the decisions that we make in April 2020 will have long-lasting effects. And the practices that we're putting in place now, how do we ensure that those practices are the best that we can do in this environment? Because there's a high chance that they'll most likely still be the practices we could be looking at in 2025 or 2030. So if there's one thing I think we hope you to get out of this session, it is really to be able to work through that thing. Yes, please. Justice is truth in action. And these are my children, but I go on mute. Sorry guys, hi everyone. Yes, this quote by Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister of Great Britain, during the third cholera epidemic has never been more heartening than now, when services we've taken for granted are under immense pressure. Australia has been working towards prioritising a more accessible and user-focused justice system for the last several years. This has seen initiatives such as the shift to using plain language in courts and legal resources, the adoption of video-enabled justice to connect users in remote parts of the country to a court, and working to decrease the waiting time for court applications to hearings. In some states, we have also seen the pilot or adoption of online courts for certain jurisdictions. Government and the judiciary are at a critical juncture where increased demand for justice services are predicted as a secondary outcome of the contemporary pandemic. Family violence is expected to rise as families adjust to sudden pressure and changes to daily life. And we may see the corresponding increased applications for intervention orders. The Fair Work Ombudsman is being flooded by employees and employers trying to understand the best way to carry on. Police are being asked to meet new needs to help create safety in a time of crisis and cannot afford to spend hours waiting to appear as a witness in a court case. Time citizens spend waiting for their hearings to commence must be minimised as courts everywhere reduce gatherings for people indoors. And now is the time for urgent transformation to make justice more accessible. And now I'd like to pass over to Luke Thomas, Legal Design Researcher at Portable.
Great, thank you, Simon. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of how we've been approaching legal design. And I mean, currently there are huge problems to consider and changes to be made, but we've always had changes in the justice sector, and we've always had this question of how can we design better justice? So to do that, I'm going to talk through some principles that we have for applying it. So design thinking has always been around it's always been focused on a process for creatively and strategically solving problems. But if you're not familiar with what human-centered design is and the distinction it has, it's a renewed understanding of how to create solutions by shifting the focus to the people at the center of the problem. So it's been used to improve services and create usable and engaging technology. It's been used by businesses to better understand their clients, by technology platforms to better understand their users, and by governments to better understand their citizens in order to meet their needs and craft solutions that are targeted towards them. Thanks to enterprising researchers, lawyers, and academics around the world, including Margaret Hagan, who literally wrote the book on law by design, and definitely check out the read, it's on the internet if you haven't looked at it already. Legal design is now its own discipline with its own methodology and focus. So it borrows heavily from design thinking, human-centered design. We use agile principles, but we also have some unique principles that we put in place for designing for legal services. And in our experiences, there are some subtle differences and shifts we have to make in the way we do things. For example, instead of creating a better way to get users to sign up to your service, to download more hits to whatever it is you want them to do for business goals, what we're doing is creating a better service because the experience that people are going to have with the legal service is usually inevitable. So for a lot of people, they don't want to go to court. So the design solution is how to improve that experience for them because they have to be there, not because we want them there. But what's really encouraging for us is that we found that there's really a passion in the justice sector in Australia to be more empathetic and be more accessible and provide more plain English information. People are going above and beyond business as usual in a way we've never seen before in the sector, which I really am starting to appreciate and love the passion out there. People are actively seeking out user-centered solution and seeking feedback, which is great. And another big difference we have is that for legal aid especially, there's different kinds of user groups we have to think about. So there's different kinds of research and understanding we have to undertake. There's people who may be more vulnerable groups, people with mental health issues, literacy issues, and the significance of the subject matter and its impacts is huge for people. So we really do have to provide more focus than just the typical HCD methodologies that we use in the studio. So these are 4 legal design principles that we use to approach legal design. It's by no means an exhaustive list. There's plenty more stuff out there. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but this is just kind of our jumping off point in our conversation about how to innovate during hard times. So I'm going to walk through these 4 examples of these 4 principles and provide examples for each one of some ways we've tried to meet needs following these principles. The first one is about rethinking law as a service and not just an institution. So this is really about challenging what you think is necessary or immovable just because that's the way it's always been. It's looking at other sectors and industries to see how they're meeting user needs and then trying to adapt that to legal services. In this example, it's an image for a dashboard panel for Courtsight, which is also known as Your Way, as it's currently called. It's installed in the Shepparton Law Courts, which is a facility that houses the tribunal and the magistrates court in a regional area outside, about 2 hours outside Melbourne. It's about using in-court ticketing and wayfinding to provide people with a less stressful experience. And it's using proven designs from other industries like airport screens, so very similar to having court screens with your name, the time, the location to show where you are in the queue, and real-time SMS updates for progress, like similar to what we've used in doctors' offices, for example. If my appointment's delayed, I get a text message letting me know. We've been applying that to courts and found great progress. We would really like to use it to provide more proactive real-time data, so things like case volume, traffic, how many no-shows there's been, to better understand and adapt to the needs of the people visiting the courts. Our second principle is about designing solutions alongside the people who experience the problem. So co-design is at the heart of legal design. And for us, this means researching and designing solutions alongside the people who will use the technology, which in this case is been applied to your case. which is an app that we've been developing for the past 2 years, part of a grant for the Department of Premier and Cabinet, part of the Innovation Fund. And we did it alongside the members of the Victims Survivors Advisory Council to learn what people's experiences have been like going to court for intervention orders. So people who have experienced family violence, you're already in a very stressful, obviously traumatic position, and you want to be able to navigate court to the best of your ability, but there's just so much to think about. So what we did was co-design how they would want to experience our technology in order to provide the best solution alongside them. It's been launched recently, currently under a pilot program with Victoria Police. And it's all about providing simple information about what to expect from the court process. So helping users keep track of hearings, manage their documents, and send reminders about their orders and upcoming dates. Our third principle is about being intentional with key interactions and information. So as services, legal services especially, moved online, there was a desire at first to provide people with all the information, because there's this exciting new platform, the internet was open, people can Google information, they can go to your legal aid webpage, but there are just streams and streams of text, and there's large questions, large paragraphs. What we want to do is learn how to better reduce the amount of words, eliminate jargon, and provide intuitive and accessible online and in-person experiences. An example we've been working on for this is a project you can see in front of you. It's screens from an app we're launching called Amica, which has been designed alongside National Legal Aid for the past 2 years. It's part of the Legal Services Commission South Australia and our partnership to provide users with a way to negotiate their own property and parenting arrangements after they've recently separated or divorced. So it's a way for users to provide the information they need to be able to either make a parenting plan so they can go forward with greater clarity on how to raise their kids together, or to negotiate a settlement of their joint assets. So instead of providing what is currently online in long pieces of paper and forms, we've tried to take that information, distill it down to what they really need to know, and then provide progressive disclosure for different user types. So what this means is focusing on who's using the app. Is it someone who just wants to get through the process, so we can be intentional with how little information, but there are people who actually want to read every single word, so we can also provide progressive disclosure. It's putting your users in mind and really thinking about what information that user that you have in mind needs to see. And for a fourth project, I'm actually going to let Jane talk more about this later when she talks about legal aid's progress, but this has been a pretty exciting partnership also for about the last 2 years that we've had with Legal Aid New South Wales. We were approached to do design research for them to think about how would their users, so we approached users actually, they were really great about getting us in front of clients and just asked them, how would you like to experience legal aid online? From this, there was a lot of big changes to make. There's overhauls of their client management systems. There's ways to get people through the door differently. You can change physical space. You can put tablets in place. So there's a lot of different ways to meet their needs. But what we were looking at is what's the quick win? What's the low-hanging fruit that we can use to meet needs where they are, cheaply, cost-effectively, and quick? So what we worked on was an AusPost style, Australia Post. So just basically a parcel tracker, but for your legal aid grants. Because one of the problems people were experiencing was just not getting enough communication from legal aid as they applied for the grant, and then leading to a lot of stress as you're waiting to hear back from legal aid. You also have court dates coming up. So what we did was try to get people in front of us while we're designing it, and then co-design with them, test with them, try to solve this problem early instead of waiting for the overall reform. So what I'm going to do now is actually pass over to Shannon Salter so she can get to talking about the really exciting stuff going on in Canada. So online dispute resolution, ways for people to resolve disputes before going to court, but also online courts. So Shannon Salter is the chair of the Civil Resolution Tribunal. It's Canada's first online tribunal, and she's an adjunct professor at the UBC Allard School of Law as well. So I had the pleasure of seeing her present on the opportunities for ODR at the ODR International Symposium here in Melbourne in 2018. And now I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk with her today. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you very much, Luke, and Sarah and Simon. Can you hear me?
I can now, yeah.
Excellent, great. And so I'll ask you to drive the slideshow as we go along, I guess.
Cool.
Yeah. Great.
Thanks so much for joining us from Canada.
Pardon me?
Thanks so much for joining us all the way from Canada.
Oh, it's no problem. It's the evening here, and I've managed to boot both my husband and my children out of the house, which is a thing that would have been more of a struggle earlier. So thank you for the opportunity for a quiet hour alone. It's been very rare over the last 3 weeks. So I was asked by Sarah and Simon to cover some of the questions that you'll see on the screen as we move along. And I'll try to make that fairly brief so that we have lots of time to hear from Jane and also hear your questions as well. It's been a very interesting time for the Civil Resolution Tribunal in BC, which is the first online tribunal in Canada. And because it's online, I get to go to places, beautiful places like Melbourne, and talk about it. And I very much miss your beautiful corner of the world. So I am getting a lot of questions about the CRT. There's understandably a really renewed interest in online courts and tribunals right now. And thankfully, mainly due to a distributed workforce and the fact that we offer online services, we've been able to stay open and operate normally over the last 3 weeks, and we expect to be able to do so going forward, which is a pretty enviable position to be in when courts in Canada and British Columbia and around the world are largely shutting down in the face of COVID-19 and are scrambling just to figure out how to meet urgent matters and to maintain a basic level of the rule of law in this context. So I'll try and contextualize my answers in that regard. So what are the most pressing needs we've been hearing about in court since COVID-19? I expect, like all of you, the biggest issue for courts in Canada appears to be literally how to deal with those extremely pressing criminal matters where people are currently incarcerated, awaiting bail hearings, awaiting trial, in the face of constitutional requirements that they be given rights of habeas corpus and rights to make requests for bail and also to advance with their trials in a timely manner. I'm by no means an expert in criminal law, but it's clear to see from basic news coverage that that is one of the most pressing needs that courts are facing right now, how to meet their constitutional obligations in this crisis. I think the second tier to that is how going forward to maintain some form of access such that limitation periods can be met, other urgent matters, particularly family matters, can be heard. And then as a third tier, other civil matters, how do we deal with that? It's not hard to see also looking down the road just a little bit that the longer courts are largely shuttered in any country, the more there is a potential for irreparable injustice, for the erosion of the rule of law, and also for an inevitable backlog of cases that are already going to add to these pressing delays that every common law jurisdiction has in their courts. Every place in the world I visited has a backlog of cases to get through, and delay compromises access as well. So there's a bit of a snowball effect, and understandably, there's tranches of most urgent matters, but you can tell that there'll be knock-on effects down the road as well. Can you tell us about your experience in participating in audio-visual links in courtrooms or tribunals? My only experience is with the Civil Resolution Tribunal. Under our statute, we have the ability to hold hearings in a variety of ways, and it's up to our discretion to decide how to hold a hearing. Most of our cases proceed by way of the written documents. However, sometimes we have to have an oral hearing, and if so, that happens via Skype for Business. So all of our tribunal members have training in how to hold hearings virtually through platforms like Zoom and Skype for Business. Of course, there are some benefits to doing that, and there are some challenges as well. You need to be able to convey a sense of decorum and gravitas in a setting where you can't rely on some of the artifacts of a traditional courtroom. This is something, Simon, I think you were talking about at the beginning, or Sarah. And I have definitely a bunch of other views and rants about some of the ways that as lawyers and judges, we hide behind some of those artifacts. Tribunals tend to be less formal, and certainly I've never had an experience in running hundreds and hundreds of hearings in person in a rather informal tribunal setting, and also now virtually, where parties have been disrespectful or rude or otherwise ignored the authority of the tribunal by virtue of the fact that I wasn't wearing robes, wasn't sitting on a dais, and wasn't banging a gavel. So I think it is important for us as the justice sector to interrogate some of the ideas that we have about those artifacts of our justice system, which I think in many cases can serve to actually distance ourselves from the people we serve. That's not to say that gravitas isn't important, but in my view, it's much more important, or it's much more powerful to set an appropriate tone, a tone of respect and a degree of formality in a virtual hearing, and that goes a very long distance in terms of managing to have a fair hearing, along with empathy and emotional intelligence. I think some of the benefits of a remote hearing are that people can participate from an environment that's already adapted to their needs, which is particularly important for people with various physical disabilities and also mental health issues. And some of the advantages also include the fact that if somebody is being unruly or not respecting their turn to talk, you can mute everybody and then selectively unmute them. I could have probably quite a list of that, but in the interest of time, I'll keep it moving. How can more courts move towards ODR models like the Civil Resolution Tribunal? What are the barriers and enablers? I think certainly one of the big enablers is need, and there's no time like the present to really tell us about how powerful it is to have a strong need to push you in a direction or to push you to take risks that as a culture within the legal profession, we can sometimes be reluctant to take. So the enablers, I think, are a culture of experimentation, kind of a startup culture where you take risks, where you are prepared to admit if you're wrong, where you can be agile about changing over time. The barriers are not primarily technological barriers. I like to talk about how when the Civil Resolution Tribunal opened, we did so with a web page, an online form, a pretty decent user experience for the member of the public, but behind the scenes, our case management system consisted of 2 lockdown Excel spreadsheets and a SharePoint site. And all to say that you can do a tremendous amount without a whole lot of technology. So that's not the big barrier. The big barrier is a cultural one, I think. It's a culture where we tend to resist change, where we do not interrogate some of the long-held assumptions that we have about why the justice system has to work the way it does. And also, frankly, a culture that says, by virtue of our education and experience, that we are the experts in the justice system, rather than the people who have to use the system itself. And we're certainly the experts in the law, but I think one of the biggest barriers is a refusal to acknowledge that the people who use the justice system are experts in their own experience, and we need to center that in order to effectively implement reform. What additional considerations should we be mindful of when moving online? I hear these considerations a lot, issues about privacy, data security, and user experience. To address the first two, obviously data security and privacy are very important. On the other hand, some of the biggest privacy failures that I've seen in the justice system have happened through manual processes. The wrong decision gets stuffed in the wrong envelope and sent to the wrong parties. Media are given access to paper files that they're not entitled to because there's a publication ban. So it's not to say that that's not important, and I'm not saying, oh, look over there, paper processes are fallible too. It is to say that we need to be careful about not overbuilding in order to zealously guard against risks, which you can mitigate in other ways. One of the ways to mitigate privacy concerns is to be really careful about the kinds of data that you collect in the first place. It's obviously very important also to pick as your platform a solution that's been well tested, is scalable, and meets top of the line security requirements. And that's a big argument against building something yourself. In my view, it's also a big argument about having your own data center somewhere near the library in your courthouse. It's a good argument in favor of exploring top of the line cloud solutions. User experience is probably the biggest thing we need to be concerned about. It's the heart of everything we do at the tribunal. We center the experience of people who have traditional barriers to accessing the justice system. They are the focus of all of our initial testing, our designing, our prototyping, and where we can't get access to those folks directly, we talk to their representatives. So community legal advocates who represent people with barriers like physical and mental disabilities, mental health issues, literacy issues, people with a low income, and so on. And they really are at the heart of all of what we do, because our view is that if you can design around people with the biggest barriers and then scale to accommodate everyday people and lawyers, then you're probably going to be able to radically improve access to justice. It doesn't work the other way around, though. If you design something for lawyers and then tell yourself later that you will scale it to be able to accommodate the needs of people with disabilities, it's just not going to work. What you're going to end up with is something very similar to what we already have. Hindsight is 2020. What should we try to learn now to be more prepared in the future? Well, I don't think anybody would have predicted a year ago the advent of global pandemic. There are certainly risks that were built into the justice system that were entirely foreseeable and that have been well documented over time. We know there's radical access problems. We know that the justice system everywhere I go is unaffordable, it is complicated, it is needlessly procedurally heavy. It creates a lot of administrative burdens for the people who can least afford to bear them. And what we're seeing now is kind of a perfect storm where a lot of those pressures that vulnerable people experience are now distributed to the public at large. None of us can leave our home easily. None of us can travel. Lots of us are experiencing economic barriers. Lots of us are suddenly thrust into a position where we're navigating legal problems to do with employment, rental situations, and other things. And so while this particular access problem probably wasn't foreseeable, there are an entirely the large majority of access to justice problems are very well documented. So how should we try to be more prepared in the future? I think the more that we can be flexible, offer choice to people, use human-centered design, try to account for and anticipate the wide variety of circumstances people live in, that kind of agility is going to place us in a good position to be able to account for whatever life throws at us in the future. The key is flexibility, versatility, and the ability to agilely pivot when that's called for. And that's something, unfortunately, that we're seeing our court systems around the world are not very well placed to do.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, I think that leads well into some of the opportunities that we're seeing within legal aid. As Sarah mentioned before, we'll take a Q&A at the end for Shannon and both for Jane. So some of the questions that we've been thinking on over the last number of weeks is, this is really that opportunity now for the sector to be innovative. Even if there's been the intent of doing it before, now is that time, purely because there is still the need to deliver essential services during this pandemic. And what are other sectors doing to handle that change? We've all seen big shifts in work towards home over the last number of weeks, massive shifts within retail, in online shopping. I think all of us recognise that the world we come out with at the end of 2020 or going into 2021 will be quite different to the one that we came into within COVID-19. And in some ways, our reflection is that we'll just accelerate a lot of things that were already happening anyway. And, what are the opportunities that we can do to, I guess, catch that wave of innovation, but still to ensure that users are in the centre. As Shannon mentioned before, some of the technology could be seen as, as ubiquitous, but it's really essential that we are putting users in the centre of what we're doing. And it's within that lens that I'd like to introduce Jane Siffins. Jane is the Director of Client Services for Legal Aid New South Wales and has spent the last 20 years working in the legal assistance sector in management, research and service design and delivery. The roles have spanned NGO, private and public sectors, and prior to this, she was a social worker in the mental health sector, which I think we all recognise as a sector that will be hit hard as we're going through COVID-19. Jane has a Bachelor of Social Work, a Masters of Social Policy and a Masters in Public Administration. And as an experienced facilitator, she loves to post notes, which is paper and messy conversations, including this one. So welcome, Jane. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar. And I'd like to start with a question, I guess, how was Legal Aid New South Wales? And for those that don't know, it is the largest legal aid body in Australia and one of the largest legal institutions in Australia anyway. How were sort of services being delivered before all this happened the last few weeks?
Thanks, Simon. Yes, certainly we were in a transition phase over the last few years in terms of transitioning some of our more traditional services over, and doing that using human-centered design with small, fast trials. I guess we still, though, we're in that transition, so very heavily focused on face-to-face services, some telephone and very little online. Really what this has been for us is a massive fast trial at scale of what we basically were doing. We thought we were doing it quite fast until the last 3 weeks, and then things have changed in terms of speed, is what I would say. So certainly everything has changed for us in the last 3 weeks. There wouldn't be any part of our organisation or our service delivery that hasn't changed, and hasn't changed multiple times in that last 3 weeks. So what we're seeing is this, the design cycle of, discover, ideate, design, test it out, and then, try again. We're doing that sometimes twice a day. So really, really fast. What's good about that is that we have some experience doing it at a normal pace prior to this. So the other thing I just mentioned there is that this is on the back of the bushfires. So we had unprecedented disaster situation in New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland before Christmas and over Christmas. So we were already starting to increase that pace of flexible service delivery. And without even taking a breath, we've gone into this pandemic environment. So everybody is heightened, kind of out of their comfort zone, and a little, traumatized, really. So it's in that environment as well. So the opportunities for us have been, I don't want to kind of sound too positive, but certainly we've had extraordinary opportunities in terms of speeding up some of the changes that we were doing on a smaller scale. So completely swapping our front-end service delivery, so that advice and information service, to phone. We were still operating some very big drop-in face-to-face clinics, legal clinics. We know that from a user perspective, they can be pretty atrocious, really long waiting times, very demoralising kind of model of service. Which we were, moving the culture on that. We had to just ditch it straight away. And that has been, from my perspective, has been fantastic, because the user experience of being able to actually request a service in my own home, receiving a phone call from the lawyer and getting that service, as Shannon said, in a place that's accessible and comfortable for me, is really, has been a 3-week change. And that seems to be operating really well. What we're seeing is a much increased demand, because we've uncovered demand that we weren't servicing before. How can we move to delivering justice online? Certainly, as Luke showed, we've been in a process of looking at that and starting to do that. With Portable delivered the grants tracker earlier last year, and now doing the upscale of that and looking at a client portal as well. You can do it on a budget, a very tight budget. What we're finding in this rapid kind of phase is clearly just moving to things that people are already using. So definitely heavily relying on phone, AVL, audiovisual links, and even not so much with our clients, but between our staff and with our partners, things like WhatsApp. And internally in legal aid, using we launched a closed Facebook group yesterday. So really looking at what people are already using and really maximising that. In terms of the courts, definitely audiovisual, so AVL, which was already reasonably rolled out in New South Wales, looking at email, phone, and obviously just on papers written. What do I think the legal aid landscape will look like after this? I had a catch up on Skype for Business with other legal aid commissions last night, with the client service areas there. We all agree it will never look the same. There's no going back to where we were before. So certainly there is a new normal. We're finding what that is right now. I think in the next few weeks we'll start to settle into what that is. The legal aid landscape will look much more flexible, much more user-focused as well. There are changes that have rapidly happened in the courts, and Shannon alluded to this, that are not user-centred. So certainly access to take instructions from or speak to our clients in custody is incredibly limited right now, and that's a real concern. Also the move to, you know, first appearances via AVL, which we've been resisting for some time because we want access to our clients. We want them to participate in that first mention, particularly first appearance. And obviously that's now all online, and our concerns are about people's ability to participate in their own matters, their ability to do that in a place in a way that they can hear, that they can understand, and that is private. And, you know, we're certainly facing some challenges around that. So whilst there's a lot of opportunities, we're moving fast to where we want to go, we know there are some things that are happening that we need to pull back when we return to an environment that is less restrictive. How will we reflect on this in 5 years' time? I think certainly we already had an agenda to change and to move the system, and you know, I think that vision is still the same. I think what we'll reflect on is how, you know, I think we'll probably laugh about all the barriers we used to think there were. Certainly my colleagues in other states were just saying basically now, no, we won't accept no. Any barrier, we just work around it. We are, you know, for example, we are saying to staff who can't work remotely for a range of reasons, just pick up your desktop, take it home and plug it in. Now, we would never have thought 4 weeks ago that we would have said to staff, just take everything off your desk and take it home to be able to deliver services and take calls, etc. So that rapid modernisation, I think what we will see is that actually you can have a clear, ruthless focus on what is important. And the things that are important right now are about liberty, safety, you know, that people have an income and shelter, and having a ruthless focus on that and how to deliver that service means that those barriers that we always have had in the past, you know, clearly they're kind of nothing. The big barriers that we're facing are probably around things like stability of internet connection, and you know, certainly how staff working remotely, to be able to get staff more out of our offices. We've got about 70% working from home now, but internet stability, which the whole world is probably dealing with at the moment as well. Certainly it's really focusing our attention on where our next investment needs to be. For example, turning web chat on in Law Access, our contact centre in New South Wales. I know other contact centres we haven't had it. So really focusing our attention on where we need to invest, and they're not large investments, to be able to really see some changes here.
Thanks, Jane. It's a good place to maybe pass back to you, Sarah, on those points. The point you just made then, they're not necessarily big investments. And I think that's sort of like could be a silver lining through part of this. So Sarah, do you want me to pass back to you to facilitate the Q&A?
Yes, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Shannon. I'd just like to read out now a comment that we've had in. I am aware that my internet connection isn't very stable, so please bear with me. From John Zelevnikov in the audience, he's got a comment. At La Trobe, we built lots of systems for Victoria Legal Aid, circa 2000. We had lots of ARC, that's the Australia Research Council, grants to work with legal aid on family law, plea bargaining, refugee law. But when things became financially tight, the work was dropped. So all the infrastructure which would now be valuable was lost. And I think that's a really important kind of hindsight is 2020. Where could we have been today if that investment was not as easily dismissed? I turn now to a question from Jonathan Yeats. It hasn't been directed to any specific panelist. The question is, what impact do you think COVID-19 will have on integration and collaboration in the sector? Not just between the jurisdictions, but their relationships with external agencies and the community sectors. Panelists, would anyone like to answer?
I'm happy to go first on that one. So certainly, again, we're in that rapid change. So I think this is something we need to address more readily over the next few weeks. But in terms of our justice sector partners, we've had to very rapidly collaborate, particularly around courts and tribunals. And that has been, you know, fast and furious, again, with a critical focus on what's important. This week, we've launched the new local court model in collaboration with our partners, and that's been, brilliant. And the fact that there's, because it is really doing a trial at scale, that constant feedback and conversation. So that's certainly moved all of that along. A partnership with Law Access New South Wales, the contact centre in New South Wales, has been, brilliant. Again, started with the bushfires, with the disaster there, rapidly mobilising to make services available for customers who are not able to pursue normal avenues. And really just designing on the hop lots of, online meetings and phone meetings to just try again to find new solutions. I think in terms of our community partners, we've had definitely some conversations with them, particularly about supporting our more vulnerable client groups. Again, it's just been too fast to keep track of what the service delivery model is for everybody in the world in the human services sector. And that's the piece of work I think over the next few weeks we want to go back to. We're getting lots of emails from services trying to work out how we can work together. So I think in the fast pace, that human service sector, particularly turning our mind to our clients who are still on the streets, literally, and are not able to access services, even by phone. How are we working together to ensure that they receive a service, particularly vulnerable under the new public health orders that we've seen announced this week in New South Wales, in terms of, you're not allowed to be out and loitering and hanging around. So, yeah, challenges still to come.
Thank you. We turn now to the next question from Brett Cooper. We are now seeing the justice system responding to their service delivery model as a result of a global tragedy. What is everyone's thoughts around why executives and judicial officers have such a high level of discomfort to digital transformation in the access to justice space? And if you'll permit me, I'll try and combine this with another question that's come up in the chat, which is around lawyers in particular. So where the previous question was talking about executives and judicial officers, a similar question: how can we better help lawyers who do not typically use technology on how not to be afraid of technology? It acknowledges that, Shannon, you've answered this in terms of a cultural approach, but we're looking for more one-on-one ideas to support lawyers.
Well, I'm happy to jump in terms of my own experience, and I don't think it's the fault of any judge or any particular court administrator, this failure. It's a collective systemic failure. In my experience, judges and court administrators and registry staff are all very, very committed to access to justice. But unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be this collective will to do the really difficult cultural work of doing human-centered design. And so I know or part of the question anyway was trying to get at specifics. I do think that the culture is a problem. And the culture in common law countries particularly is a problem because we literally put judges on a pedestal. We literally put ourselves as lawyers on a bit of a pedestal, and we decorate ourselves with robes and in some cases wigs and Latin, and we make ourselves the experts. And that is diametrically opposed to the philosophy behind human-centered design and agile judicial reform. And until we fundamentally change the culture and acknowledge that the justice system doesn't belong to us, it belongs to the people who use it, who pay for it, who are entitled to it as citizens and residents of the country in which they live, until we fundamentally accept and feel that in our marrow, we're going to have a really difficult time changing. Because from day one in law school all the way throughout our careers, we are taught that our value is in our expertise and in our privileged position within the legal system. And that is a problem. It is antithetical to what needs to happen. So that's the negative note. I do think, though, that there are reasons to be very hopeful. You see projects around the world, not the least of which is Margaret Hagan's project in Stanford, what you're doing at Portable. multiplied by thousands of examples around the world, and that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. And there is an emerging understanding among judges and court administrators that this is a thing that has to happen. And I think, unfortunately, the tragedy of COVID-19, as tragic as it is, if there's a thin silver lining, it might be that it is a major accelerant to that cultural change that has to happen. Because the real human hardship is going to throw this, and frankly, the democratizing of access to justice issues for everybody across the board is making this necessary and stark. So the old adage about necessity being the mother of invention, I think, is applicable here. And I do sense a tremendous degree of willingness, again, coming from these good-hearted people whose job it is to make sure that our system is open, even in times of crisis. So maybe, Jane, you might want to comment in terms of lawyers, but I think, not that I speak in any way on behalf of public justice systems, but I think that is the biggest barrier, is a cultural one.
Yeah, look, I think I agree with what Shannon's saying, but in terms of, I guess, operationalising with our workforce of lawyers, one of the things that we've learned over the last few years is when we're looking at major changes in terms of the service model or the way we deliver services, that people, I guess where their uncomfortableness comes from is that these aren't the rules that we've been following. So very rules-based kind of approach. What are the rules? What does the legislation say? And when we start to, really mix up the rules, I guess, people are thrown into a place they find very difficult. So what we've found really useful, and we did this time as well 3 weeks ago, was to agree with our executive group on what are the high-level principles that we're going to use in terms of our rapid adaptation to this situation. And we've done that in the past as well when we're doing some kind of major change that people are going to feel like the rules are shifting. At least pin it to some principles that we all agree to. And, our legal assistance sector is very values-based. People I think, have a very common kind of set of principles that they operate around. And so we came up with the COVID-19 principles when we're in terms of how we're going to make decisions, because lots of circumstances didn't have a rules answer. We hadn't faced that situation before. We didn't have, the instruction book to go to find out how to deal with something. So instead of that, the 2 main rules that we came up with a whole lot of principles, but the 2 were that client and staff safety were paramount. So those, that just basically settled everybody down to begin with. They are paramount, but that needs to be the number 1 principle. The second principle is that service delivery will be client-centered. That's one of our ongoing, basic core values for legal aid, but it was important to say in COVID-19 that client-centered service delivery is still one of our fundamental principles. And then we had some principles about adapting quickly and being flexible and all those kinds of things. And I think when we were getting lots of inquiries from lawyers, how do I face this conversation with a client? How do I deal with this situation? Lots and lots of questions because the rules were different. We would say, well, let's go back to the principles. These are the principles that we're designing around. How could we deal with this situation using these principles? And people, found some comfort in that. So I guess that would be the other, piece of learning for us is when the rules are out the window, you need to give something to people to anchor onto. And I think a principles approach is very appropriate in this environment.
And just to jump in there, and I know, Sarah, you might have another question, but that's exactly, I think, the key to a lot of this reform is that we get really caught up in the way that we've always done things, and we confuse that with the legal requirements. So, when you're given kind of a blank slate like the CRT, it gave us the freedom to say, well, the rule of law is the principle here. The goalposts are procedural fairness. The goalposts are the right to be heard, the right to have your decision made by an independent adjudicator and so on. How do we give effect? How do we get the ball to those goalposts in a way that is going to be accessible and efficient for people? And so I always try to encourage lawyers that I'm talking to say, let's not get attached to the process. Let's get attached to those principles. Exactly as you're saying, Jane, let's think about why it is that procedure was there 100 years ago and figure out what it's meant to accomplish. We could have a whole other conversation about open courts, but if the whole principle behind open courts is that you're meant to be able to see how the decision maker is deciding, to see, to introduce transparency and accountability to that process. It isn't literally that you should be able to sit on a wooden bench. That in a court, that nobody does if anyone's visited a courthouse. So how in a modern context can we enshrine those really important principles, but think carefully about how it is that we could achieve them? And if you apply that at scale across everything we do in the justice system, or all the rules that lawyers adhere to, that really can unleash a tremendous amount of creativity, I think, and increase in access. And I totally agree with you.
Thank you, Jana.
I'd jump in there as well, Sarah, really quick, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So just on I totally agree with all the culture and total reform, but in terms of my experience working with lawyers one-on-one, if we're just talking about tech avoidance and tech fear, I find myself being kind of a technology evangelist to lawyers I work with, but also a legal evangelist to the technologists I work with. But one thing that's been really helpful with working with lawyers at the Legal Services Commission, who have to manage and support back end and handle queries from people who are using the ODR tool, is to actually go up there and treat them like users. So doing our own design sessions with them, but also just listening to them and sitting with them one-on-one and working out what their fears are, and then trying to come up with solutions to either address that fear or redesign how we're doing it so it actually meets their needs as well. So it is just about treating them like a user and listening and responding to what's creating that fear and how can we design solutions for it.
Thank you, Luke. Potentially one for Shannon, and maybe there's a principled kind of approach or answer to this as well. We've got a question that's really asking about what happens when technology breaks down in the CRT. Does it ever happen? And if so, how do you resolve that?
Yeah, luckily, we've been pretty fortunate in never having downtime. Our system is built on Salesforce, so there's a design point there in picking a large off-the-shelf solution to be the engine, so that when it fails, which it hasn't, there are going to be much larger clients than us who are screaming and jumping up and down, large financial institutions and government. But you know, technology risk is always there. And I think the COVID-19 crisis points to the importance of having strong business continuity plans, having plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, and making sure that, and so there's that, but also feeding into what I was saying earlier, that if you build a system that's flexible, that offers choice to people, then you can also account for that. So if we had a technology failure where the system was down, well, we've got paper forms. We have frontline staff with telephones who can take applications over the phone. We have video conferencing. We have in-person help at 60 government points around the province. You can always pick a different channel. You can always think about and anticipate, well, you can't always, COVID-19 shows you can't always anticipate these things, but you can anticipate the vast majority of common risks and then design around them. So these are design challenges. They shouldn't be the start and the end of the analysis. And I actually used to hear that, well, you know, if you have any downtime, then you shouldn't use technology at all. It's just too risky. Or 100% of people don't have access to the internet, therefore you should not offer online services. And that bleeds into a temptation we sometimes have as legal professionals to think in terms of binaries too much. And of course, the solution is that it's a design challenge and you have to design around it by offering choice and flexibility.
Thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and so I wanted to thank everyone who has put questions on here already, and knowing that people might have meetings to get to, thank also our panelists and everyone who's participated. I'm going to throw one final question at our panelists and happy for anyone to answer. It's by John Cena. The emergency has rapidly focused our service delivery choices and created space for relatively radical reforms. How do we carry on the change agenda when we return to normality with all its noise, competing cultural, organizational, and other priorities? I'd like to extend panelists to answer. I think it's a great note to end on. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, John. Look, for us, it's going to be about collecting the evidence. So treating it like a massive trial. And what we've learned from doing that over the last few years is to make sure that we're collecting the data that we want to use to decide what the new normal after this pandemic is going to be. So, for example, in New South Wales, we've got the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research is going to monitor the impact of this change in the local court operating model to see what was the impact on the outcomes that people achieve in the system, the waiting times, the various elements that go into that system. For us, in terms of our service model, it will be capturing the feedback and the experiences of our clients, our staff, and support services as well, so that we don't miss the opportunity to really take what really worked and scale it up, and the things that didn't work to let them fall aside as we go forward. So my view is really seeing this as a massive scale trial and do all the same observations and collection of data that we would do if it was a small one.
I'll just really quickly chime in and say that I really hope that legal service providers and courts adopt Jane's methodology to this. And I do fear I've been a bit of a downer this session, but I will just flag that I think two of the risks that we could see are that, one, if the pandemic it comes under control fairly quickly and a lot of these restrictions are lifted, which everybody hopes happens, that what could happen is a pretty rapid shift back to normal in the justice system and no real long-term change. And I think that would be a missed opportunity. Secondly, my other fear is that in the haste and urgency of the situation, what we're not going to do is that cultural work. We're not going to do that human-centered design. We're going to slap a web form onto our website or a fillable PDF form that we can scan and fax back and call it done. And that's not human-centered design. That's not going to increase access to justice in the long term. It may account for the most urgent, most constitutionally vulnerable issues right now, but it won't lead to the kind of enduring change that we need. And to the extent that those kinds of processes can become entrenched by virtue of their use, I think that's a hazard too. So I really hope that we adopt Jane's approach and use this as an opportunity to experiment and be iterative and think long-term about what we could build in the after times.
Thank you very much, Jane and Shannon. Simon and Luke, any final thoughts to close us out?
No, I think the point of Shannon's one is a good one. Like the decisions that we make now, if we have to live with them for another 5 to 10 years, how are we going to be making those decisions?
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Shannon, Jane, Luke, Simon, John Z, who's I think zoomed off to a 12 o'clock webinar, and everybody else. I'd like to acknowledge that we haven't been able to get to everyone's answers and invite you to continue the dialogue with us at events@portable.com.au. We'll try our best to be able to keep facilitating these and other webinars in the future. Thank you, everyone. If you wanted to turn your video on and give us a wave as we close out, that'd be lovely to see your faces. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.